Hello, my name is Father Timothy Tighe, and I want to welcome you to Overview 13 of our journey of faith in the light of the cross, and I thank you so much for joining us. We look up on our screen and we see the theme for Overview 13. Numbers, the book of Numbers, records the grumbling six-stop journey from Sinai to the Jordan River, which parallels the six-stop grumbling journey to Sinai in Exodus. Numbers completes the core of Torah. Egypt to Sinai, Sinai covenant in the middle, and Sinai to the river Jordan finally completing the journey. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Numbers 10 to 25 records the grumbling on the second journey from Sinai to the river Jordan. The J, around 950, edited these two journeys handed down from the time of Moses around 1150, 200 years. The P, in 550, in Babylon, conceived the idea of putting all Mosaic teaching together as Torah. So it wasn't Torah until P in 550 in Babylon. So P ordered the teachings with memorizing aids for students to memorize Torah, such as adding 6 stops on each journey. 6 stops from Egypt to Sinai, and 6 stops from Sinai to the river Jordan. And it's very hard for us to read those 6 stops, but you can if you do it carefully. We go on to the next screen, and we see the chart. We see that in Exodus 12 to 18, the journey to Sinai in 6 stops to Exodus 18. Then at Sinai, the J records the original covenant with the 10 commandments from 19 to 24. Then P, hundreds of years later, adds 25 to 40. That's all about the priest and the meeting tent and sacrifice. Then we go to Leviticus, and P adds laws all through Leviticus to Numbers 10 and continues with genealogies to Numbers 10. Then we have the final journey. In Numbers 11, the journey, 6 stops to the river Jordan. This is very important. Later on, we will add Deuteronomy, Moses' last teaching, and Genesis, all about sin and the patriarchs. We go on to our next screen. Israel wanted to journey heroically, but God just demanded too much. So they grumbled. The J writers around 950 recorded both journeys with all the grumbling and complaining. Then P, hundreds of years later, added more legal substance to the Sinai covenant, with Leviticus and Numbers 1 to 10 inserted in between the two journeys. The first journey from Egypt to Sinai demanded such heroism that some preferred returning to slavery in Egypt for a more secure life. We go to our next screen, which is again our chart. And again, we review it so we get this context in our minds because it's very difficult. The 6-stop journey to Sinai, then the Sinai covenant, the original, then P adds more, then the P adds even more in Leviticus and Numbers 10, then Numbers 11, the journey, 6 stops to the river Jordan. And you have here the core of Torah. We go on to our next screen. The exiles around 580 agreed with Israel's grumbling. Yahweh and the priests demanded too much heroism from the humiliated victims of the 2 terrible journeys into exile in Babylon. More, the exiles were enduring a terrible life in ghettos for years. The grumbling led many to abandon Judaism, preferring alien life, Gentile life, in Babylon than struggling to return to Israel. So P's exiles in 550 identified with J's Egyptian slaves 600 years before in 1150. I hope this doesn't challenge you too much. We go on to the next screen and we read. Genealogies were important to determine bloodlines and who could own land in Israel. So both J and P carefully recorded genealogies. Since Jacob cursed Levites for killing Gentiles who raped their sister Tamar, that's in Genesis 40, all priests and Levites were excluded from owning land. So we ask, why were careful Levite genealogies kept, which we will answer in the next overview. More, as Israel began their journey from Egypt, Jay writes of the non-blood aliens in their midst who would always resent not owning land. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Exodus 12:37. Israel set out from Ramses for Succoth with about 600,000 men. But this is the important part. A great mixed crowd joined them as well as livestock. That's mixed blood people who will never own land. Jay wrote, as they saw Solomon allow alien wives to act out the fertility cults, which led to Israel's split from Judah at Solomon's death in 922. So Jay wrote later, but he was looking at this terrible influence by Gentiles, aliens. Then Jay adds a verse that seems disconnected. Exodus 12:39. They baked unleavened dough to eat, for they had no time to prepare other food. It seems disconnected. We go on to our next screen. But Moses saw the connection, for he was educated with Pharaoh's sons. So he knew extra leaven corrupted and blew up the flour so it was easy to chew, swallow, and digest. But it also reduced the nutrition to junk food that kept slaves weak, undernourished, and easier to control. The unleavened dough seemed by chance, but it was Yahweh's way of reminding Israel that they were to be an incorruptible free people. Moses knew leaven symbolized corruption, and he had to teach that. We go on to our next screen and we read, Israel left Egypt around 1180 and journeyed 40 years. P edited around 580, so Torah was composed over a 600-year period. P then adds to J another theme in the next verse. This is very complicated, but we're going to pull it together. Exodus 40. Israel stayed in Egypt for 430 years. Jacob's family passed over into a new life as the one nation of Israel, soon under law. So the family became a nation under law. J's verse 39 feared Israel's corruption by too many aliens in their midst, for they were the leaven. P's verse 40, Israel must eat only unleavened bread, which leads us back to grumbling themes. So now we come back to grumbling. We go to our next screen and we read, in John 3:14, Jesus says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life. Now, why did Jesus say this? Jesus refers to Numbers 21:4, our journey to the Promised Land and the Jordan River. With their patience worn out, the people grumbled against God and Moses. Did you bring us out here to die in the desert without food or water? We are disgusted with this wretched food. This is real complaining and grumbling. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Numbers 21:6. So the Lord sent serpents which bit people who died. So they said to Moses, we have sinned by grumbling against Yahweh and you. Pray Yahweh take the serpents from us. Verse 8. So Moses prayed, and the Lord said, make a serpent and put it on a pole. If anyone who was bitten looks up at it, they will recover. Verse 9. So Moses mounted a bronze serpent on a pole. Those bitten who looked up did recover. Now we have to break open the story's teaching and go into it a little more deeply. So we go on to our next screen and we continue reading. When the grumbling broke their oneness with God and Moses, the people lapsed into tribalism. As one people under Moses, they had little food and water, but when shared, everyone got enough. That's important. But 12 tribes did not trust each other to share. So they began fighting and killing each other. Some realized their grumbling tongues had become toxic serpents that started the killing. They asked Moses to pray for forgiveness. God said to Moses, Lift up a serpent on a pole. Those who look up will recover. We go on to our next screen. Those who looked up at the serpent also saw God's universe as one. They also realized that all humans breathe the same life-giving air, which clears the mind and opens the eyes to see how all creation is working together in oneness. They realized that when toxic feelings welled up, their eyes lowered and fixated on their own little world. They forgot they were one nation. They lost the big picture and forgot the purpose of Israel's journey to the land of promise. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. Their toxic tongues were also contagious. Soon everyone saw any other tribe as an enemy. In their toxic thinking, they preferred slavery security to the joy of taking responsibility for their lives, their families, and Israel as one nation. They preferred the leavened slave bread, for it was easy to chew and swallow and digest. But with little nutrition, it left them weak and grumbling. They were once again thinking like slaves, grumbling, fighting, and blaming each other. We go on to our next screen and we continue reading. God offered them the unleavened bread of freedom. It was hard to chew, hard to swallow and digest, but it was full of nutrition. But when heroism called, the old slave poison welled up again, and confidence lapsed into grumbling. Those who looked up at the bronze serpent saw it was radiant in the sun when not biting. They realized that their own tongues could be radiant when they used their tongues to encourage one another to work together as one nation. We continue reading in our next screen. Those who looked up recovered from the toxic feelings and journeyed to the promised land. Jesus came to free all people from sin's toxic slavery, to journey as one people to eternal life. When toxic feelings well up, believers need to look up at the crucifix to detox us of sin's mindless, leavened junk food, and instead to eat the unleavened crucified body that nourishes life-giving love and frees us to journey heroically as one into eternal life. We go on to our next screen and we read our theme. Numbers records the grumbling 6-stop journey from Sinai to the Jordan, which parallels the 6-stop grumbling journey to Sinai in Exodus. Numbers completes the core of Torah. Egypt to Sinai, Sinai covenant, and Sinai to the river Jordan. I thank you so much for joining us for this overview number 13 on our journey of faith in the light of the cross. I know it's challenging you, but the Bible does that. It's not easy. Thank you so much for joining with us.